Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. Thank you for joining us.
So June 3rd, just a few days ago, was the 20th anniversary of my ordination. I was duly ordained by Lakehead Unitarian Fellowship in Thunder Bay and Wausau Universalist Unitarian Church, and we held the ceremony at First Unitarian Church of Duluth, which was sort of a halfway point. I went looking for a photo to post to mark this occasion, and I found a photo of me standing beside Duluth's wayside pulpit, on which was a quote from Henry David Thoreau: "The strongest is always the least violent." The strongest is always the least violent. I think we have a slide of that. A curious bit of serendipity, I think, given today's topic. And I think I had it in my head that Thoreau had studied Gandhi. But in fact, Thoreau died several years before Gandhi was born. Now, it's easy to think that we are living in the worst of times in regards to human warring and violence. But in truth, the 19th century was a profoundly turbulent era. This slide comes a little later, so you could take it off. That's great. Major conflicts of that century range from the massive global reach of the Napoleonic Wars to the bloodiest conflict in North American history, our own Civil War. That war actually ended just a few years before Thoreau's death. And I expect that world events played a huge role in leading both Thoreau and Gandhi to embrace the philosophy of nonviolence. The strongest is always the least violent. Now, at least in my experience, this is not how we're wired. It seems that when we feel threatened or experience a conflict, the default response is, to gird one's loins, to raise one's hackles, to get out the claws, and to lash out in anger, making ourselves as big as possible in emotion and strength and voice. We lash out. We look for strength in violence and vitriol. Turning to nonviolence instead is a yeoman-sized evolutionary task. It just doesn't come natural yet. Now, it's hard to get a clear picture of how the idea of nonviolence came into being, but a philosophy of nonviolence dates back to ancient India, where the ethical principle of ahimsa, meaning non-injury or non-harm, was first codified. This is the tradition that gave birth to Mahatma Gandhi, whose nonviolent resistance is perhaps best exemplified in the Salt March of 1930. That was a 240-mile march to the sea. And they went to the sea in protest of the British colonial monopoly and the heavy taxes on salt, because at the sea they could make their own salt. And 50,000 people marched with Gandhi in that action, which is an early act of civil disobedience that resulted in mass arrests and worldwide attention. So what exactly is nonviolence, or better, nonviolent action or nonviolent resistance? A widely accepted definition was offered by Gene Sharp in Waging Nonviolent Struggle, and I paraphrase: "Nonviolent action is a general technique of protest, resistance, and intervention without physical violence that takes place outside of normal political, social, or economic behavior. And it's based on the insight that economic, social, political, and military power ultimately relies on the consent and obedience of the people. And if people don't obey, rulers cannot rule." So examples of nonviolent action include Gandhi's Salt March, but also economic boycotts and mass strikes, such as the large action here in Minneapolis last January. It includes the way that artists abandoned their gigs at the Kennedy Center, which now is being scrubbed of Trump's name. It can be building up alternative structures of support. When the government doesn't show up for us, it's building alternative structures such as mutual aid. And it's also things like the non-cooperation of civil servants such as the staff, who as a matter of principle have left many, many government agencies. You know, there's no shortage of academic work on nonviolent action and its effectiveness, and indeed it is or can be very effective and can make change possible, even though it may seem incredibly slow. Now, I read about a colleague of mine who likes to play with numbers, Reverend James Kubel-Komodo, who figured out that it was 45 years, 4 months, and 23 days between August 28, 1963, when Dr. King proclaimed his dream for the United States of America, and January 20th, 2009, when Barack Hussein Obama took the oath of office. And he also calculated that it is 1.9 miles from the Lincoln Memorial where King spoke, across the National Mall to the steps of the US Capitol. That journey through time sped along, James calculated, at 7 inches per day, which, while painfully slow, still happened within many of our lifetimes. Nonviolent resistance works, in MLK Jr.'s words, by dramatizing, quote, the evils of our society in such a way that pressure is brought to bear against injustices by the forces of goodwill, unquote. It works because it puts the opponent in a double bind. You know, if they can't repress the nonviolent actors, it undermines their position. And if they use violent repression, it increases sympathy with the resistors. I don't know if any of you have yet listened to Scott Pelley's recent interview with the New York Times. In it, he talks about the 60-minute story that was almost pulled from the air about the killings and protests in Minneapolis, almost pulled ostensibly for not supporting Trump's viewpoint. And Pelley talks about how they had worked very hard in creating that story to show all sides of the issue, including the ways and times in which protesters had been violent. Violence that was being used by ICE as reason to become more aggressive and punishing. Nonviolent resistance is, in my opinion, the better way. But as I say, it takes patience and tenacity, and it generally requires us to act outside of what's expected of us, which can be risky because it's threatening to the status quo. It's risky. In his lifetime, while we are so enamored and love what MLK Jr. had to say now, during his lifetime, he was more maligned than loved. And his assassination is painful evidence of that. As you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was a devoted student of nonviolent action, as well as, I think, one of our great teachers. In his first book, which was called Stride Toward Freedom, King outlined 6 basic principles that are at the foundation of this philosophy, and I'm just going to briefly list them. Number 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is active resistance to evil that is not for cowards. Number 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Nonviolence is a path to the creation of the beloved community. Number 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice or evil, not people. It understands that evildoers are also victims of the system. Number 4, nonviolence holds that unearned voluntary suffering for a just cause can educate and transform people and societies Because the role of suffering in change-making is controversial and multivariant, I think this particular one is a tough one that deserves careful study beyond my message today. It's hard to advocate for suffering, but nonetheless, King held this as a principle. Number 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate, and nonviolent love is unselfish and creative. And number 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice and has faith that justice will eventually win. Now, I encourage you to do your own research and learning about the philosophy and tactics of nonviolent action. For today, after offering this too brief overview, I just want to talk about what nonviolence can mean for us. I hope he doesn't mind that I name him, but it's Matt Lassegard who handed me this topic for today. And he had a career in law enforcement. And I'm sure he has seen more than any human's share of violence. Similarly, our community, our state, has witnessed the full gamut of violence and resistance over the past 6 months, more than our share too. Not that a share of violence should need to be taken by any of us. From what I know of Matt and his work and beyond, he has looked for ways to respond nonviolently. And I also suspect that for him and for every one of us, getting there is a lifelong journey that requires courage and persistence. So let's talk about that a bit. You know, if nonviolence is not the response that we necessarily come programmed with, if nonviolence is an action that's outside of our animal reactivity, how do we learn nonviolence? How do we practice it? King said that nonviolent resistance is a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. And since love is at the center of this faith, a lot can be said for practicing the kind of humanism that impels and compels us to use our powers to fight for justice with the transforming power of love. Love of neighbor, love of planet, love of ourselves, love of enemy, even love of the enemy. And such love, when it relates to systems and to the presence of injustice, is a kind of love that's resistant and defiant and out in the streets, holding each other accountable. To protest nonviolently is to live love. I just want to note that these photos were taken in the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, and the smaller photo on the right shows Dana Greeley, who was at that time the president of the UUA at that march. King also said, the nonviolent approach does not immediately change the heart of the oppressor. It first does something to the hearts and souls of those committed to it. It gives them new self-respect. It calls up sources of strength and courage they did not know they had. The first thing it does is work in the hearts and souls of those who are committed to nonviolence. And then very famously, King said, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. But how do we do this? How do we overcome our violent impulses? I return to the words that Jenna shared earlier. Love and nonviolent action does not require us to get rid of our discontent. In fact, it is critical that we witness the injustices of the world with open eyes and open hearts. But instead of responding with hate or violence, love needs to be channeled into nonviolent creative actions that disrupt the systems that would keep us silent. We need to channel our discontent in nonviolent ways. And I believe that we do that by really intentionally learning and practicing, in the very same way that we have to do in order to change any habit. There is much going on about which to be discontented. ICE operatives are still present in our city. I just noticed a post from a friend yesterday that someone had been snatched from her street. They're still here, and they're all around the nation. They're grabbing people from their homes and families. And now there is news from 5051 Minnesota that ICE wants to reopen the Prairie Correctional Facility in Appleton as a 1,600 capacity immigrant detention center run by private prison giant CoreCivic. And if approved, it would be one of the largest ICE detention facilities in the US, 60% larger than Delaney Hall. And they're betting this can happen quietly in a small town far from the headlines. We cannot do nothing, and violence isn't the answer. So finding more and more creative ways to show up, to practice civil disobedience, to make our voices heard, is simply what we need to do, and we can do it together. You know, I think Singing Resistance is a great example of this. People coming together to sing about change, about a vision for a loving world, standing in the streets in solidarity with folks singing. In joining in that movement, some was particularly moved by singing to ICE agents, "It's okay to change your mind. Give up your weapons. Leave this behind." Another example is the incredible costumes worn by many to protests. You know, whether it's frogs or dinosaurs or big orange babies, this tactical frivolity, it's tactical frivolity. It was popularized by the Portland Frog Brigade. It uses playful dress to share political messaging in a nonviolent way and to disrupt the usual tense dynamics between protesters and law enforcement. You know, I think it might be kind of impossible to be violent when dressed as a frog. And signs, you know, oh my, the protest signs. Carrying a sign with a poignant message is a way to amplify one's voice and message in a larger-than-life way. You know, whether it's on the streets or in front of your home, in your car window. You know, I have to say that I love the punny ones, but my favorites really are the ones that simply call us back to our values of kindness and love. Love your neighbor. Be kind. Make America kind again. Simple words that are so hard to live. They're not really hard to live. I don't think it's as hard as that to simply be kind. But let's just keep trying to do that. Let's keep practicing nonviolent resistance to all the injustice and the evil that swirls around us. After all, only love can drive out hate. I'm going to close with these words of Maya Angelou, modified slightly for inclusive language. We, this people, on this small and drifting planet, whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living, yet those same hands can touch with such healing and irresistible tenderness. We, this people on this wayward floating body, created on this earth, of this earth, we have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where every person can live freely without sanctimonious piety, without crippling fear. We, this people, in whose mouths abide cankerous words which challenge our very existence, yet out of those same mouths come songs of such exquisite sweetness that the heart falters in its labor and the body is quieted into awe. When we come to it, to the day of peacemaking, we must confess that we are the possible, we are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. In our miraculousness, let us be extremists for love and for the extension of justice in this beautiful world that we share. So may it be.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org. What's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.